My name is Ashley Carter. I'm 34 years old, and up until 8 months ago, I thought I was living a pretty normal life. I had a good job, my own apartment in Denver, and a family that I thought, despite all the drama, still had some kind of love underneath it all. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I found out exactly how wrong I was standing in a funeral home, wearing black, watching my stepfather crack a smile over my grandmother's coffin like he had just won the lottery. Because in his mind, he had. Let me back up a little. My grandmother, Eleanor May Carter, built everything from scratch. I mean, everything. She started a small logistics company in 1974 with nothing but a beat-up truck and a handshake deal. By the time I was born, that company had grown into one of the most respected freight and logistics operations in the entire Midwest. By the time she passed, Carter Logistics was valued at just under $350 million. She was 81 years old, sharp as a blade until her last breath, and she loved me in a way that I still cannot fully put into words. She called me her shadow because I followed her everywhere as a little girl. I sat in her office, watched her take calls, watched her shut down men twice her size with nothing but a calm voice and a look that said she had already won before the conversation started. She used to say, "Ashley, never let anyone see you sweat and never let anyone take what you built." I did not fully understand what she meant back then. I do now. My stepfather, Richard Hollis, married my mother when I was 11. He was charming, well-dressed, always smiling, always had something smooth to say. My mother loved him completely, and I tried to love him too, I really did. But Richard had a way of looking at things that belonged to other people like they already belonged to him. He had been working inside my grandmother's company for almost 15 years, started as an operations manager, worked his way up because my grandmother gave him the chance out of respect for my mother. And somewhere along the way, Richard decided that respect meant ownership. My brother Derek, his biological son from a previous marriage, grew up in our house, sat at our table, called my grandmother Grandma L, just like I did, but Derek was different from me in ways that mattered. He was lazy, entitled, and he had learned everything he knew about ambition from his father, which means he had learned how to want things without earning them. The day of my grandmother's funeral was cold. It was a Tuesday in November, and the sky was that heavy gray color that makes everything feel muffled and slow. The service was held at Riverside Memorial, a beautiful old chapel that my grandmother herself had selected years before because she liked the way the light came through the windows in the afternoon. There were nearly 300 people there, her employees, her business partners, old friends, community members whose lives she had touched over 5 decades. I sat in the front row next to my mother, who was quietly falling apart beside me, and I held her hand and stared at the casket and tried to hold myself together. It was after the service, during the private family gathering in the reception room, that it happened. We were barely 20 minutes past saying our final goodbyes when Richard stood up, straightened his jacket, and cleared his throat like he was about to give a board presentation. He looked around the room at the family, at my grandmother's 2 sisters, at her longtime attorney Gerald Brooks, who was sitting quietly in the corner. And Richard said with a smile that I will never forget, "Well, Eleanor always said she wanted the company to stay in strong hands." And I think everyone here knows that Derek is ready to step into that role. $350 million and everything Eleanor built is going to land exactly where it was always meant to land. The room went quiet. Not a comfortable quiet. The kind of quiet where people are looking at the floor or suddenly very interested in their coffee cup because they do not know where to look. My grandmother's sister, Paulette, pressed her lips together. Gerald Brooks, the attorney, did not move a muscle, but I watched his eyes and they shifted just slightly in a way I cannot read yet. My mother said nothing. Derek stood next to his father, looking like he had just been handed a trophy he did not even have to compete for. And I sat there, completely still, because something my grandmother told me 3 weeks before she passed was sitting in the back of my mind, and it was getting louder by the second. Hit that like button, because what Richard did not know yet was about to change everything. 3 weeks before my grandmother passed, she called me on a Thursday evening around 7 o'clock. I remember it clearly because I had just gotten home from work and I was still in my coat when my phone rang. She did not sound sick that night. She sounded like herself, focused and direct, the way she always was when something important needed to be said. She told me she needed me to come see her that weekend. Not for dinner, not just to visit, but because she had something to show me and something to tell me that could not wait much longer. I drove up to her house in Colorado Springs that Saturday morning, and we sat in her study, the room with all her old photographs and the big oak desk she had used for 40 years. And she told me everything. She told me she had seen Richard changing over the last 2 years. She said she had watched him slowly start treating the company like it was already his, making decisions without consulting her, shifting small things in ways that most people would not notice, but she noticed because she built every single piece of it. She told me she had quietly updated her will 6 months prior with Gerald Brooks, and that she had made arrangements that Richard did not know about and would not see coming. Then she opened the top right drawer of that oak desk, and she handed me a sealed envelope, and she said, "Ashley, this goes to Gerald the moment I am gone. Do not open it. Do not tell anyone you have it. Just make sure it gets to him." I took that envelope. I held it in both hands, and I looked at her and I told her I would handle it. She patted my hand and said, "I know you will, Shadow. I know you will." I had that envelope in my apartment the entire time Richard was standing in that reception room, smiling like he had already won. It was in a locked fireproof box under my bed, exactly where I had placed it the night I got home from Colorado Springs. And as I sat there watching Derek nod along, while his father painted this picture of a smooth and certain inheritance, I was calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from not caring. The kind trees swayed gent spins, that comes from knowing something the other person does not know yet. I did not say a word in that reception room. I let Richard finish talking. I watched Gerald Brooks quietly excuse himself and step outside, and I made a mental note of that. I hugged my mother, I said goodbye to my grandmother's sisters, and I drove home. That same night I called Gerald. He picked up on the second ring, and before I could say much, he said, "Ashley, I was hoping you would call. I said, I have something that belongs to you." He said, "I know. Can you come to my office Monday morning first thing?" I said yes, and I hung up, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time, thinking about my grandmother and everything she built and everything she trusted me to protect. Monday morning came, and I walked into Gerald's office at 8:30 sharp with the envelope in my bag. He opened it carefully, read through the documents inside, and then he looked up at me over his glasses and said, "She was thorough. She was always thorough." I asked him what it meant for Richard and Derek. He set the papers down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "It means Mr. Hollis is about to have a very bad week." What my grandmother had done was not just update a will. She had restructured the entire ownership framework of Carter Logistics months before she passed. She had moved controlling interest into a private trust, named me as the primary trustee and beneficiary, and included a detailed letter of intent explaining exactly why she had made these decisions and exactly what she had witnessed Richard doing inside her company over the prior 2 years. She had also, in this part, made my chest tight in the best possible way, hired an independent auditor 6 months prior who had quietly reviewed the company's financials and found a pattern of unauthorized expense approvals tied directly to Richard. Gerald told me that between the trust documents, the letter of intent, and the audit findings, Richard Hollis had no legal claim to anything, not one share, not $1. Not the building, not the contracts, not the trucks, nothing. I went home that afternoon and I did something I had not done since the funeral. I cried, not out of sadness, out of something I cannot fully explain, except to say it felt like my grandmother was still in the room with me. And the hardest part was still coming because Richard did not know any of this yet, and the moment he found out was going to be something I would never forget. Gerald scheduled a formal reading of the estate documents for the following Friday. He sent certified letters to all required parties, which meant Richard and Derek received official notice that they were required to attend a legal meeting regarding the estate of Eleanor May Carter. Richard called my mother that same evening, completely confident, telling her this was just standard procedure and that everything was going to be handled smoothly and that the transition of the company into Derek's hands would probably take 60 to 90 days. My mother listened and said very little. She already knew the truth by then because I had sat with her the night before and told her everything, the envelope, the trust, the auditor, all of it. She cried. Then she got quiet for a long time and finally said, "Your grandmother always knew exactly what she was doing." I said, "Yes, ma'am, she did." Friday morning arrived, and I put on the same black blazer I had worn to the funeral because it felt right. I drove to Gerald's office downtown and walked into the conference room at 9 o'clock sharp. Gerald was already seated at the head of the table. His paralegal was beside him with a thick folder of documents. My grandmother's 2 sisters were present as witnesses, and then Richard walked in with Derek right behind him, both of them dressed sharp, both of them carrying that easy confidence of men who believe the meeting is a formality. Richard saw me sitting at the table, and his expression shifted for just a half second. Something flickered behind his eyes, but he smoothed it over fast and gave me a nod like I was furniture. He sat down across from me, leaned back in his chair, and folded his hands on the table like a man who owns the room. Gerald opened the meeting calmly and professionally. He explained that Eleanor May Carter had executed a comprehensive estate restructuring document 8 months prior to her passing. He explained the private trust, the ownership transfer, the trustee designation. He slid a copy of the documents across the table toward Richard and Derek. Richard picked it up. He started reading, and I watched his face the way my grandmother used to watch people, quietly, without expression, taking in every detail. The color left his face somewhere around the 2nd page. By the 3rd page, his jaw had tightened, and he set the papers down very carefully like he was trying to control his hands. Derek looked over at his father, and I watched the confusion move across his face as he tried to understand what he was reading. Gerald continued speaking in that same calm, professional tone, explaining that controlling interest in Carter Logistics, all associated assets, real estate holdings, and financial accounts tied to the estate had been placed in trust with Ashley Marie Carter, designated as sole primary trustee and beneficiary. Richard looked up from the papers and stared directly at Gerald and said, "This is not valid. Eleanor was not in the right state of mind. We will contest this." Gerald looked back at him without blinking and said, "Miss." Carter was evaluated by 2 independent physicians 6 months prior to signing, both of whom certified full cognitive capacity, and the documents were executed and notarized in the presence of 3 witnesses. You are welcome to pursue a legal challenge, but I want to be transparent with you. The audit findings alone present a significant complication for any claim you might attempt to bring. That word, audit, landed in the room like something heavy hitting the floor. Richard went completely still. Derek looked at his father, and for the first time since I had known that boy, he looked genuinely lost. Richard said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then he straightened up and said he needed to speak with his own attorney. Gerald said, "Of course," and slid a second document across the table and said, "This is a formal notice regarding the audit findings, which will be referred to the appropriate authorities unless a full repayment agreement is reached within 30 days. Richard picked up that document, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of that conference room without saying another word to anyone. Derek followed him out, and the door closed behind him, and the room was quiet. Gerald looked at me and said, "Your grandmother would be proud." I pressed my lips together and nodded because I did not trust my voice in that moment. Outside that window, the sun had finally broken through the November clouds, and the light was coming in strong and clean across the conference table, and I thought about a little girl following her. Grandmother around an office, watching her take calls, watching her shut down men twice her size, with nothing but a calm voice. My grandmother built something real, and she trusted me to protect it, and I did. Carter Logistics is mine now. Every truck, every contract, every dollar she earned across 50 years of hard work. Richard repaid every cent within the 30 days and resigned quietly. Derek has not called me since. And I wake up every morning, walk into that office, sit behind that big oak desk, and I think about what she told me. Never let anyone see you sweat, and never let anyone take what you built. I never will.